When the axes finally fell silent and the shield walls collapsed, the battlefield did not become peaceful. It became eerily controlled, almost ritualistic, as if the violence had merely changed its shape. The men lay dead where they had fallen, their suffering complete, but for the women who remained alive, the true terror was only beginning. Viking sagas celebrate battle and bravery, yet they grow strangely quiet about these moments, as though words themselves recoiled from what followed. Archaeology explains that silence. Once the fighting ended, Norse war culture shifted from chaos to procedure. Survivors were gathered deliberately, separated, and watched. This was not rage spilling over from battle, but a calculated transition into a system governed by custom, belief, and law. In ruined monasteries and burned settlements across Ireland and Anglo-Saxon England, iron restraints have been found fitted precisely for women's wrists and ankles, evidence that captivity was anticipated long before the first sword was drawn. These were not improvised acts of cruelty. They were part of an established order. A defeated warrior's wife was no longer seen as a grieving human being, but as a spoil created by victory. Contemporary chroniclers often ended their accounts at the moment of triumph, listing the dead and the plunder, then falling silent. That silence was not ignorance, it was avoidance. What happened next was understood, accepted, and therefore left unspoken. Women were bound and held under guard while decisions were made about their fate, decisions shaped not by mercy, but by entitlement. Norse belief framed victory as proof of divine favor, and anything taken afterward was considered sanctioned by higher powers. To resist was not only futile, it was interpreted as defiance of fate itself. The days after a raid were often the most dangerous. Evidence from soil samples and mass graves suggests that some women were killed not in the heat of conquest, but later, once emotions cooled and choices were formalized. Bodies found in nearby bogs show wounds delivered from behind, broken forearms raised in defense, and signs of restraint still in place. These were not battlefield deaths. They were executions carried out with intention. As night fell over shattered settlements, the women who remained alive were forced to confront a grim reality. Survival did not mean safety. It meant waiting. Waiting to be claimed, traded, or discarded. Within the longhouses lit by fire and shadow, men discussed ownership while the captives stood silent, unable to understand the words, yet fully grasping their meaning. History often portrays Vikings as fierce but honest warriors. Yet beneath that image lay a system where cruelty was orderly and suffering was regulated. The battlefield had been only the opening act. What followed was governed by rules darker than war, rules that transformed living people into objects of law and ritual. And as the smoke cleared and ravens circled overhead, the women understood a truth that history would later try to forget. Death had spared the men, but it had passed them by, leaving them to face a fate the sagas barely dared to name. In the Viking world, cruelty did not exist outside the law. It was embedded within it. Once the captives were secured, the fate of a defeated warrior's wife was decided not by impulse, but by custom spoken aloud before witnesses. Norse legal traditions treated victory as a transfer of rights, and those rights extended to human beings. A slain man's wife was not recognized as a widow in need of protection. She was recognized as property created by conquest. Early Scandinavian law codes and later Icelandic texts describe a chilling procedure in which the warrior who killed her husband could formally claim her. The declaration was public, deliberate, and binding. From that moment, the woman ceased to exist as an individual under the law. Her consent was neither requested nor required. The act was not considered immoral. It was considered orderly. The law did not ask whether she wished to live, leave, or resist. It asked only whether the claim was made correctly and on time. These claims had limits, not for the woman's sake, but to prevent conflict between men. A captor had only a short window to assert ownership. If he failed, other warriors could contest the claim, turning the woman into a prize, disputed long after her husband's body had grown cold. This urgency made the days after a raid especially dangerous. To be unclaimed was not to be spared. It was to be exposed. A woman without an owner had no legal status at all. She could be traded, abused, or killed without consequence, because the law existed to regulate rivalry, not compassion. Forced marriage was one of the most common outcomes, and it was not seen as a violation. It was recognized as lawful union. Any children born from such a marriage were considered legitimate, binding violence directly into bloodlines and inheritance. In this way, conquest reshaped families and futures without ever acknowledging the suffering involved. Later storytellers attempted to soften this reality, suggesting captives might eventually gain status or acceptance. The physical evidence tells a harsher story. Skeletal remains of women in Norse settlements show signs of repeated injury, nutritional stress, and long-term restraint. These were not women gradually welcomed into new lives. They were controlled. Isotope analysis reveals that many buried in Scandinavia were not born there. Their bones carried chemical traces of distant lands, proof of forced relocation across seas. Religion reinforced what law permitted. Victory was interpreted as a sign of divine approval, and what followed was believed to reflect cosmic order. To question the treatment of captives was to question fate itself. This belief insulated violence from guilt and transformed suffering into duty. Viking law is often praised as advanced for its time, but in these codes lies a darker truth. Civilization did not eliminate brutality. It organized it. As women stood silently while claims were spoken over their heads, they learned that the law offered no refuge. It did not restrain violence. It gave it structure. And as night closed in on conquered settlements, the captives understood that survival had not freed them. It had simply placed them inside a system designed to erase who they had been, a system whose consequences would stretch far beyond the battlefield and far beyond memory. By the 9th century, the Viking world had turned human captivity into an industry, one that stretched far beyond the battlefield and deep into the heart of Norse trade networks. For many defeated warriors' wives, the days of waiting ended not with freedom or death, but with transport. They were marched under guard to coastal settlements, loaded onto ships, and carried across seas toward markets designed specifically for selling people. Dublin emerged as one of the most notorious centers of this trade. Archaeological excavations at Wood Quay uncovered iron shackles shaped precisely for women's wrists and ankles, along with storage buildings that were not meant for goods, but for human bodies held until sale. These finds reveal planning, infrastructure, and scale. Slavery was not an accident of war. It was a pillar of Viking expansion. Written fragments and runic inscriptions support what the ground exposes. Prices were standardized and coldly calculated. A young woman fetched more silver than an older one. A mother was worth less. Injury reduced value further. Humanity was translated into numbers. Buyers examined captives openly, checking limbs, teeth, and posture, while guards ensured compliance through chains and threat. These transactions took place in daylight, near harbors, surrounded by the normal flow of commerce. No secrecy was required, because no shame was attached. Once sold, a woman could be transported again, sometimes multiple times, her identity stripped away with each exchange. Isotope analysis of female skeletons buried in Norse towns across Scandinavia shows chemical signatures from Ireland, Scotland, and Anglo-Saxon England, confirming forced relocation over vast distances. These women did not migrate. They were moved. For some captives, being sold was considered the best possible outcome, because the alternative was far more final. Evidence from bogs near raided settlements reveals women who are never taken to market at all. Their bodies show signs of deliberate, controlled violence carried out days after the initial attack. Blows from behind, fractured forearms raised in defense, bindings still in place. These were not deaths born of chaos or anger. They were decisions. Women deemed too injured, too defiant, or simply surplus to demand were killed rather than maintained. Even for those who survived sale, life offered no protection. Slavery in the Viking Age was permanent. Norse law did not recognize the testimony of slaves. Abuse required no justification. Children born to enslaved women inherited their mother's status, binding captivity into the next generation. Excavations near Norse camps have uncovered infant bones bearing clear signs of blunt force trauma, suggesting that children unable to work were killed as economic burdens. This was not madness, it was calculation. The slave trade fueled raids as reliably as silver and land. Ships were designed to carry captives alongside plunder, and campaigns were planned with human capture in mind. Yet medieval writers often reduced this system to silence, preferring heroic tales of conquest over uncomfortable truths. Archaeology does not look away. Chains do not exaggerate. Bones do not soften their story. Together, they reveal a world where survival depended not on innocence or virtue, but on market demand. And as ships pulled away from burning shores, carrying women who would never return, another darker fate lingered in Norse belief, one reserved not for markets, but for ritual itself. In some cases, the fate of captured women was decided not by trade or law, but by silence. These were the women history never named, because they were never meant to survive long enough to be recorded. Archaeological evidence reveals that after certain Viking raids, a disturbing pattern followed. Women were held for days after the fighting ended, guarded and restrained, while decisions were made behind closed doors. When the decision was reached, it was final. Excavations in boglands near destroyed settlements in Ireland and Britain have uncovered female bodies deposited with deliberate care, not scattered or hurriedly buried. Their wounds tell a consistent story. Skulls fractured from behind, ribs broken by repeated blows, forearms shattered in defensive positions. These were not battlefield casualties. They were executions carried out after order had been restored. The delay matters. It shows intent. These women were killed not in chaos, but in calm. Norse culture valued control, and even death followed structure. Written sources hint at these practices indirectly, often through sudden gaps in the narrative. Chronicles describe raids in detail, listing the dead men and stolen goods, then fall abruptly silent. That silence aligns with the archaeological record. Where the pen stops, the ground begins to speak. In 862, after a Viking attack on the settlement of Portmorrow, the Irish annals record the number of warriors killed, but say nothing of the women taken from the longhouses. Nearby bogs later revealed the remains of dozens of female bodies, all showing signs of organized violence. The pattern repeats elsewhere. In 871, when the great heathen army captured Reading, chroniclers noted the defeat of King Thellard, but omitted the fate of the royal women. Excavations at the old Saxon palace uncovered stones stained with iron oxide, residue consistent with large quantities of blood. These findings suggest that executions took place indoors, away from public view, after decisions had been made. Why were these women killed instead of sold or claimed? Evidence suggests several reasons. Some were too injured to transport. Some resisted violently. Others were deemed spiritually dangerous or symbolically threatening. Norse belief placed great importance on fate and omen. Certain captives were seen as bad fortune, reminders of unfinished vengeance or broken order. Killing them was believed to restore balance. In this way, execution became ritualized cleansing. It was not considered murder, but necessity. The consistency of the wounds indicates that trained individuals carried out these acts, likely the same warriors who enforced law and ritual. There was no chaos, no crowd frenzy, just method. These deaths were part of the system, not its failure. For the women who waited during those days of silence, uncertainty was its own form of torture. Survival depended not on innocence or submission, but on usefulness and interpretation. And for those who were chosen for death, history offered no memorial, no marker, no name. Only patterns in bone remain. The executions reveal a truth Viking society tried to bury, that beneath trade, law, and ritual lay a final solution for those who did not fit. As the bodies sank into bog and earth, absorbed by landscapes that preserve flesh and memory alike, the message was clear. Victory did not just take lives in battle. It continued its work afterward, quietly, deliberately, and without witnesses, preparing the ground for an even darker ritual that awaited those spared execution. When a Viking warrior died, his death was not always considered complete until it was accompanied by sacrifice. For some captured women, especially those already enslaved or claimed, survival after a raid only delayed an ending shaped by ritual. One of the clearest descriptions comes from the Arab traveler Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who witnessed a Norse funeral along the Volga River in the 10th century. His account is calm, detailed, and chilling. A slave woman was selected to follow her master into death. She was not chosen by chance, nor asked for consent. She was prepared. Over several days, she was guarded constantly, prevented from escaping, and given intoxicating substances to dull fear and resistance. The community treated the process as sacred. Songs were sung. Rites were spoken. The woman was led from tent to tent, where ritual acts reinforced her role as an offering rather than a person. By the final day, she was killed and placed beside the dead warrior in his ship, sent toward the afterlife as property, just as she had been in life. Archaeology confirms this was not an isolated performance meant to impress a foreign observer. Across Scandinavia, boat burials have been uncovered containing female skeletons positioned unnaturally, often beside high-status male remains. Many show signs of strangulation, crushed throats, or broken ribs. Chemical analysis of teeth and bones reveals traces of henbane and other narcotics, substances known to induce hallucination and passivity. These women did not go willingly. They were subdued, controlled, and silenced. Norse belief held that a warrior's status in the afterlife depended on the completeness of his burial. Weapons, animals, and human beings were offerings meant to serve him beyond death. A woman's life was weighed against a man's honor, and the balance was considered acceptable. Some sagas refer vaguely to companions or followers in burial rites, carefully avoiding the violence required to create them. Language softened what practice demanded. Silence preserved legitimacy. The women chosen for sacrifice were almost always captives, already stripped of family and future. Their deaths were framed as destiny rather than cruelty. Yet the physical evidence suggests prolonged terror long before the final moment. Restraint marks on wrists, defensive fractures, and signs of confinement appear repeatedly in burial contexts. These women lived knowing what awaited them. The ritual did not begin at the funeral. It began the moment they were claimed. For Viking society, these sacrifices reinforced hierarchy and power. They demonstrated that victory extended beyond the battlefield, beyond life itself. Authority did not end with death. It demanded continuity. For the women, there was no escape through obedience or endurance. Their bodies became symbols, tools used to display dominance to both the living and the dead. Modern retellings often romanticize Viking burials as noble and mystical, but beneath the spectacle lies a stark truth. These were executions presented as ceremony, and as ships were burned or buried beneath earth and stone carrying warriors. Toward legend, the women placed beside them vanished from memory, absorbed into ritual, leaving behind only bones and a silence that still haunts the ground where they were laid. The final truth hidden beneath Viking conquest is not found in sagas or songs, but in what was discarded and forgotten. Archaeological excavations at Viking winter camps reveal a silence so complete it borders on deliberate erasure. Among the refuse pits, where broken tools and animal bones were thrown away, researchers uncovered the remains of infants. Dozens of them, Their skulls show blunt force trauma. Their bones bear no signs of disease or natural death. These were not stillbirths. They were killings. Viking law was explicit on a matter rarely discussed in heroic narratives. A child's status followed that of the mother. If a woman was enslaved, her child was enslaved. And if that child could not work, could not grow quickly, or was seen as a burden to a mobile warband, the solution was final. The child was killed. This was not considered murder. It was considered necessity. Brutal economics governed life as much as belief. Later records, including the Doomsday Book, suggest the practice persisted under Norse-influenced rule long after the first raids ended. Population studies in regions such as Yorkshire show unexplained gaps in infant survival that align precisely with areas of Viking settlement. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Women taken after raids lived with an impossible calculus. Bearing a child could offer temporary protection, proof of usefulness, but it could also lead to unbearable loss. Mothers watched their infants disappear, knowing that resistance would bring death. Their grief left no written trace because slaves did not leave records. Only bones remained to speak for them. Isotope analysis of female remains found in Viking camps confirms that many were not local. They were captives brought from Ireland, Scotland, and Anglo-Saxon lands, women who survived battle only to endure years of silence, violence, and loss. The numbers tell a quiet but devastating story. At one great heathen army camp, dated to the winter of 873 to 874, archaeologists uncovered 249 skeletons. Only 63 belonged to women. Women do not vanish naturally. They are taken, sold, sacrificed, or killed. The imbalance exposes a system built on removal. Viking society remembered its warriors because their deaths fed identity and legend. It forgot its victims because remembering them served no purpose. Their suffering weakened the story Vikings wanted to tell about themselves. That is why the chronicles hesitate, the sagas whisper, and history looks away. Yet the ground does not forget. The terrifying fate of defeated warriors' wives was not a series of isolated horrors, but a connected system. Capture, ownership, trade, execution, sacrifice, and erasure. Each step reinforced the next. Survival did not guarantee life. Law did not guarantee justice. Religion did not guarantee mercy. In the end, the Viking Age forces an uncomfortable reflection. A society capable of exploration, art, and poetry was equally capable of organizing cruelty with precision and belief. The women and children who vanished were not forgotten by accident. They were erased by design. And when we strip away romance and face what archaeology reveals, we are left not with legend, but with a mirror, asking how many other histories remain buried, because remembering them is too dark to endure.